I'm going to show you how to find a domain and range of a graph like this. So first of all, we got to understand what is the domain, what is the range. So let's write that down. The domain is simply looking for all the x values that exist in the relation. So in this case, we're going to look at this graph and find all the x values. So let's start with that. So to come up with the domain, we need to find out what are all the possible x values that exist along this line. And more importantly, what is the lowest and the highest values. So looking at this segment here, the endpoints are, I'm going to look at the endpoints first, and I can see the location of this endpoint is at 1, 2. Notice the x value for this point is 1, and the y value is 2. X is always first, y is always second. So think of it like alphabetical order. And then similarly, this point here, the x value is 3, the y value is 4. So x is always first, y is always second. Now, when we want to identify the domain, we're looking at what are the lowest and highest possible values, because sometimes it could keep going forever. But in here, you can see it does stop. But we're interested in, as we mentioned earlier, all the x values. So what are all the possible x values that exist in our graph here? So in this graph, one way I can look at this is that the lowest possible value, you could take this endpoint and you could bring it down to the x, because again, we're interested in the x values. And as a side note, this is the x-axis. So we're interested in the x values that exist. And if I were to bring this endpoint down, you can see that our lowest x value is 1 and the highest x value is a 3. And then all these values that are in between, these are all points. Notice that the points on the end are a lot bigger, but points really have no size. We just highlight or emphasize the endpoints by making them a little bit bigger so you can see where they, begin and end. But these are all points. So if I were to mark all these points, you can see that we would have a whole bunch, just pretty much infinitely many points in between these 2 points. And I can also map all of these points down too. So pretty much any single one of these points exist. So these are all the possible x values we can have, anything in between. But the lowest possible is a 1, because notice it's a solid endpoint here. You can see it's a solid point, which means we're including this number 1. And then this is also a solid point on the end, and that means we're including the 3. So pretty much any of these x values, including 1 and 3, so anything in between 1 and 3, including 1 and 3, are values of x that are in the domain. So these values are in the domain, or they make up the domain. And notice that since we can have many different x values, I'm going to write this in interval notation. So my domain, put a colon mark here, is going to be the set of x values that are between, so we're going to write it as an inequality, that are in between 1 and 3. So notice that it's all x values between 1 and 3, and we're also including the 1 and the 3, so that's why I put the lines underneath. And then similarly, we're going to look at the range, which is looking at all the possible y values. So our range is going to be all the possible y values that can exist on this segment in this case here. So what I do is I look at mapping each of these. So I'm going to map these to the y-axis. So if you didn't already know, this right here is the y-axis. So if I were to bring these endpoints down to the y-axis, it'll let us see what's the lowest and highest y values that exist in our range. So here I can see that since this is a solid point, 2 is going to be my lowest y value. And then my highest y value is going to be a 4, because you can see it's a solid now also. So I'm going to include the 4 in this case. And just the same way we did the domain, I'm going to do the same thing for the range. So for my range, I'll just put range is going to be the y values that are between 2 and 4. So we're including the 2 and the 4, so that's why I put the lines underneath. But this is our range. So any y value between 2 and 4 are going to be in the range.